Welcome back to our deep dive into corruption in China. Last time, we started exploring the darker side, drawing on Yuen's book, China's Gilded Age.
Yeah, we looked at how corruption in all these different forms can sometimes, actually harm economic growth.
Right, and we talked about how those, one-dimensional corruption indices, they just don't tell the whole story.
Yeah, they can be misleading. Breaking corruption down into different types, that's really essential if you want to understand its impact.
Exactly, and that's what Ang does with her, what's it called? The Unbundled Corruption Index?
The UCI,
UCI, right. It's almost like dissecting a complex machine, figuring out how each part works, right?
And this time, we're going to flip the script a bit.
Yeah, we're going
to look at get ready for some surprises here, but we're going to look at the positive aspects of corruption in China.
The positive aspects, yeah.
Particularly how it might have fueled their economic boom. It might seem a little counterintuitive, I know, but Ang argues that certain types of corruption, they can actually act as a catalyst for growth, at least in the short term.
Right. And to give everyone even more context, we're also going to be comparing China's experience to America's own Gilded Age in the 19th century.
The Gilded Age, fascinating period.
The parallels are pretty striking. So fasten your seatbelts, everyone, because this deep dive into corruption and economics and history, well, it's about to get really interesting.
I think the first thing to understand is that China, they score high on what Ang calls access money corruption on her UCI.
Okay, hold on. Remind me, what exactly is access money again? And how's that different from the corruption with theft that we talked about last time?
Right, good question. Access money is basically a system where, you've got these powerful officials, wealthy business people, and they're exchanging favors to gain access to lucrative opportunities. It's kind of like this high-stakes game of connections, and influence. Instead of just outright theft, it's more about leveraging those relationships, getting preferential treatment, securing government contracts, or navigating regulations to their advantage.
I see. So instead of just, stealing money directly, it's more about manipulating the system to benefit certain people or groups.
Precisely. And here's what's interesting. China, they're not alone in this. The U.S., South Korea, other developed economies, they also score high on access money corruption.
That's a surprise.
It is.
So are we saying that access money corruption is a necessary evil for economic growth?
I wouldn't necessarily say evil, but it certainly has played a role in the economic success of many countries. Think about America's Gilded Age in the late 19th century. It was a period of incredible economic expansion, but also rampant corruption.
Yeah, you had those powerful industrialists like Rockefeller and Carnegie. They amassed huge fortunes, often through, practices that we might consider unethical today, maybe even illegal.
Exactly. They use their wealth and their influence to secure favorable deals, manipulate markets, stifle competition.
So are we saying that China is basically going through its own Gilded Age right now?
There are definitely some striking parallels. Both China and Gilded Age America, you see this shift towards access money as they industrialized. And in both cases, this form of corruption, while ethically questionable, it fueled rapid economic growth. But just like with steroids, there can be some negative side effects.
So this access money, it fueled growth, but at what cost? What were the downsides of this system?
Well, for starters, it created massive inequality. The gap between the rich and the poor, it widened dramatically during both China's recent boom and America's Gilded Age. Remember those robber barons we talked about?
Oh, yeah, living lavish lifestyles while, so many workers were struggling just to survive.
Exactly. And in China, while millions have been lifted out of poverty, the gap between the haves and the have-nots is still significant. This kind of inequality can lead to, social unrest, instability down the line.
It also, think about it, it creates this uneven playing field. If success is just determined by who you know and how much influence you can buy, then, it becomes much harder for ordinary people to get ahead, right?
That's right. It undermines fair competition, distorts the market. It also breeds cynicism and distrust in the government, in institutions.
So while access money might boost the economy in the short term, it creates some serious long-term challenges. But if this type of corruption was so prevalent in both China and Gilded Age America, how did they manage to transition to a more sustainable system? Did they just kind of wait it out, or were there specific actions taken?
That's a great question, and one we'll explore in more detail later in our deep dive. The U.S., for example, they went through a period of reform during the Progressive Era, implementing measures to curb corruption and reduce the influence of money in politics.
So the U.S. had to, clean up its act after its Gilded Age.
Yeah, you could say that. But the question is, will China follow a similar path? Will they find a way to curb the excesses of access money without stifling the economic dynamism that's made them a global superpower?
Now that's something to think about. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's go back to China in the 80s and 90s. It sounds like things were, well, pretty chaotic back then. Where does this access money fit into all of this?
Well, the 80s and 90s, that was a period of rapid economic transformation in China. They were transitioning from a centrally planned economy to a more market-oriented system. And this shift, well, it created a lot of opportunities for corruption.
So while you had this access money happening, there were also a lot of other forms of corruption going on.
Absolutely. In fact, Eng argues that during this period, corruption with theft was actually more prevalent than access money corruption. Widespread embezzlement, misappropriation of funds, all sorts of arbitrary fees and fines being imposed.
Wow, so it was a bit of a free-for-all with officials and business people taking advantage of the chaos to line their own pockets.
You could say that. It was a time of both great opportunity and great risk. And this type of corruption, it was definitely hurting the economy, hindering growth, undermining public trust.
But things started to change in the late 90s and 2000s, right? What happened then?
That's right. The Chinese government, they started implementing administrative reforms, aimed at curbing corruption, improving governance. They got better at monitoring finances, enforcing rules, and holding officials accountable.
So they cracked down on the blatant stealing, but kind of turned a blind eye to this access money game.
Not exactly turning a blind eye. It's more complicated than that. It seems they recognize that while all corruption can be harmful, the type that directly siphons resources from the system, like embezzlement, that was more damaging to economic growth than the more indirect access money corruption.
So they focused on regulating the type of corruption that was most, detrimental to economic growth, while allowing this access money system to continue, maybe even flourish.
That's one interpretation. But to fully understand why they might have allowed the system to persist, we need to delve a little deeper into the inner workings of the Chinese system, examine the incentives at play. And that brings us to our next point. The concept of profit sharing, Chinese style.
Okay, now we're getting to the really interesting part. Tell me more about this profit sharing.
This profit sharing, it's not just about corrupt officials, lining their pockets. It's more about aligning incentives. You see, bureaucratic compensation, it's often tied to financial performance.
So the better the economy does, the more these officials stand to gain.
Precisely. Eng's research suggests that, in the long run, fostering economic growth can actually be more beneficial for these bureaucrats than just, grabbing fees and fines.
So there's a logic to this seemingly chaotic system.
There is. It's almost like they're all invested in this grand economic experiment, right?
Yeah.
Their success is tied to the success of the economy as a whole. Exactly. And this creates a powerful incentive for them to promote growth, even if it means, bending the rules a bit or turning a blind eye to certain practices. But remember, this system, it's not without its flaws. Just because it might have fueled economic growth, it doesn't make it inherently good or, sustainable in the long term.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So how does this access money and this profit sharing, how does it actually play out in the real world? Does Eng have any examples in her book that illustrate how this system works?
She does. She actually dives deep into the careers of two, infamous, now fallen Chinese officials, Bo Xilai and Ji Jianye. Both of them, they were masters of this system, using access money to drive economic growth in their respective regions.
Yeah, those names ring a bell. Bo Xilai, he was the charismatic party secretary of Chongqing, right? Mm-hmm. And Ji Jianye, he was the, Mayor Bulldozer of Nanjing?
You got it. Both of them were incredibly effective at promoting economic development, but they were also deeply entangled in, massive bribery schemes. It's a complicated story, full of contradictions.
So these are examples of how access money corruption can fuel economic growth.
Yeah.
But also how it can lead to, downfall, I guess.
Exactly. Let's start with Bo Xilai. Under his leadership, Chongqing saw massive infrastructure projects, booming GDP growth. They even had improved social welfare programs. But, it came at a cost.
A cost in terms of corruption.
Yes. And mounting debt. Bo's system, it relied heavily on access money and political favors. He cultivated this network of loyalists, rewarded them handsomely, but it created an environment that was ripe for abuse.
And what about Ji Jianye? What was his story?
Ji, he was obsessed with transforming Yangzhou into this, modern metropolis. He earned the nickname Mayor Bulldozer for his relentless pursuit of development projects. He understood the power of strategic, localized governance, but his methods were often, well, ruthless.
So he also relied on this access money to get things done.
Absolutely. He was known for his close ties to, powerful business people, his willingness to bend the rules to attract investment. He transformed Yangzhou into a tourist hotspot with a thriving industrial sector. But again, it came at a price. His aggressive approach, it alienated many and created resentment. And his corruption charges.
These cases are fascinating. They really highlight the complexities of China's economic development model. It seems like this access money system, it can be incredibly effective at driving growth, but it also creates huge risks. So, what's the takeaway here? Is Ang saying that corruption is just a necessary evil?
Not necessarily. It's more nuanced than that. She's arguing that we need to move beyond these simplistic labels of good and bad when we're talking about corruption. The reality is far more complex.
So it's not about condoning corruption, but understanding the different forms it takes and the varying impacts it can have.
Exactly. These case studies, they show us how access money can fuel growth in the short term. But it's like, it's like building a house of cards.
Yeah.
It might look impressive for a while, but it's ultimately unstable, unsustainable.
Right. It seems like the U.S. also went through a similar phase during their Gilded Age with their own, robber barons and corrupt officials, but they eventually managed to reform their system.
Yeah.
What can China learn from America's experience?
That's a key question we need to explore. Remember the progressive era we talked about earlier? The U.S., they tackled their corruption problem head-on through this series of reforms.
Right.
These reforms, they aim to level the playing field, reduce the influence of money in politics, and promote, greater transparency and accountability.
So the U.S. had to go through this period of, painful reform
Right.
to address the excesses of its Gilded Age.
You could say that. They introduced things like, campaign finance reform, antitrust laws, regulations to protect consumers and workers. These reforms, they weren't without their challenges, but they ultimately helped to create a more stable and equitable system.
So that kind of begs the question, is China heading for its own progressive era? Could Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign be the first step in, a broader push for reform? We know he's cracked down on corruption within the party, but will this lead to more systemic changes?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The anti-corruption campaign, it has been remarkably effective at, targeting individual corrupt officials, dismantling those networks of patronage. But will it be enough to address the underlying systemic issues that allow this type of corruption to flourish?
Yeah, over 1.5 million officials have been disciplined since 2012. It sounds like Xi Jinping is serious about cleaning house. But is it working? What's the impact on the economy?
There's no doubt that the campaign has had a significant impact. Our analysis of 331 city party secretaries, it reveals a fascinating pattern.
Oh.
Your chance of getting caught, it was highest if your patron, the higher up who helped you get the job, if they had already fallen.
Oh, wow.
It's like a domino effect.
So it's not just about, individual corruption. It's about dismantling those entire networks of patronage and influence.
Precisely. And that's what makes this campaign so potentially transformative. It's striking at the very heart of how power operates within the Chinese system.
But as we've seen with these, the case studies of Bo Xilai and Ji Jianye, this access money system, it can be so deeply intertwined with economic growth. So is there a risk that this crackdown could actually backfire?
There's definitely a risk. Some argue that this campaign is making officials, too risk-averse. They're so afraid of getting caught in the dragnet that they're hesitant to make, bold decisions,
Okay.
approve ambitious projects.
I see. So they're playing it safe, avoiding anything that might attract scrutiny, even if it means, missing out on opportunities for growth.
Exactly. It's a delicate balancing act. You want to curb corruption, but you don't want to stifle the entrepreneurial spirit and dynamism that has driven China's success. Finding that sweet spot, that's the challenge.
So where does this leave us? What have we learned from this deep dive into corruption in China?
Well, I think we've learned that corruption, especially in China, it's far more complex than it seems at first glance.
Right. It's not just about good versus bad.
Yeah.
It's about understanding the different forms it can take and all those different ways it can impact society and the economy.
Yeah, we've explored how this access money system, while, ethically questionable, it's played a part in China's remarkable economic growth, but also how it creates, significant risks and challenges.
We have, and we've compared China's experience to America's own Gilded Age, right?
Yeah.
Those parallels are pretty thought-provoking.
They are. And maybe, well, most importantly, you've raised questions about China's future. Will they follow a similar path to the U.S.? Reform their system to curb those, excesses of access money?
Exactly. The U.S., during their progressive era, they really tackled their corruption problem head on, right? Implemented all those reforms to level the playing field, reduce the influence of money in politics, and promote transparency and accountability.
Yeah, they did. And it makes you wonder, could Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign, could that be the first step towards a similar period of reform in China?
It's possible.
It is. I mean, the campaign has been really effective at targeting individual corrupt officials, dismantling those networks of patronage.
Over 1.5 million officials disciplined since 2012.
That's a staggering number.
It is.
But the question remains, will it lead to deeper, more systemic change? Will it really address those underlying issues that allow this kind of corruption to persist?
It's hard to imagine, like a grassroots bottom-up reform movement taking hold in China. Given their political system, it seems like, well, if reform does happen, it's more likely to come from the top down.
Probably.
But is the Chinese government even willing to embrace these kinds of reforms? Especially if they see them as potentially jeopardizing economic growth or even their own grip on power.
That's the big unknown, right?
Yeah.
But they have shown a willingness to adapt and evolve in the past.
Right.
They transitioned from a centrally planned economy to a more market-oriented system pretty successfully. And they've implemented, significant reforms to curb certain types of corruption. So it wouldn't be entirely surprising to see them embark on a new wave of reforms to address these challenges posed by access money corruption.
Especially if they start to see those reforms as necessary to maintain stability, to ensure continued economic growth, right?
Because as we've seen, those downsides of this access money system, they're becoming increasingly apparent.
They are. The widening gap between rich and poor, that uneven playing field, and the erosion of public trust. I mean, these are all serious concerns.
And let's not forget that risk of what we call lazy governance, right? Where officials become so risk-averse, they avoid making those bold decisions, taking on those ambitious projects.
Potentially stifling innovation and economic dynamism, right?
Exactly. These are real challenges that China is going to have to address if they want to achieve sustainable long-term growth.
Yeah.
The path they choose, it's going to have profound implications, not just for China, but for the whole world.
It's fascinating to think about how these two seemingly different countries, separated by time, by culture, face these remarkably similar challenges during their periods of rapid economic growth, and how the choices they made, the paths they took, they've shaped their trajectories, and they continue to resonate today.
It really does. And it highlights the fact that corruption, it's not a problem unique to developing countries. Even the most advanced economies, they're vulnerable to that corrupting influence of power and wealth.
That's right.
And it underscores the importance of, constantly striving for greater transparency, accountability, and a level playing field.
It seems like there's no easy answer, no one-size-fits-all solution to this problem of corruption. It's an ongoing challenge.
It is.
It requires vigilance, adaptability, a willingness to confront difficult questions and make those tough choices.
It's about finding that delicate balance between promoting economic growth and ensuring that growth is inclusive, sustainable, and benefits society as a whole.
Yeah.
And it's a conversation that we as engaged citizens, we need to keep having.
We do. So as we wrap up this deep dive into corruption in China, let's leave our listeners with a final thought. Keep asking those tough questions, keep challenging those assumptions, and keep exploring the complexities of these really critical issues.
Because the more we understand about the forces that shape our world, the better equipped we'll be to create a more just, equitable, and prosperous future for everyone.
That's right. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious.